Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. Today, we're continuing in the life of David. Lesson 10,333, I think. Yeah, anyway, it might feel like it. But David's story is so inexhaustible. I absolutely love the life of David, and David is a type of Christ. And so just as the story of David is inexhaustible, what we really see is it's because Christ is inexhaustible in our life. And so whenever you're reading David, just also look for the parallels to Jesus Christ, our King. Now, 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1. Now David said, "Is there anyone still who is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now, this is so counterculture to that day and age, because in that day and age, when a successor took the throne of a king and they were not in your family line, you went and killed all those family members because you would be afraid that one day they would grow up and have a coup and try to retake the throne. So David is going, hey, I want to remember Jonathan. He was my friend, and I want to do kindness to Jonathan because really I'm here because of a lot of what Jonathan did for me. And I want to remember Jonathan by remembering and doing something kind for one of his descendants. There is an important principle here, and that is really just stopping to remember those who helped you get where you are. There's no such thing as a self-made man, self-made woman. You are where you are if you're succeeding in an area of your life because somebody else helped you get there. You're standing on the shoulders of other people who went before you, people who paid a price for you to experience what you have. Romans 13, verse 7 says, "Pay to all what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." We live in a culture that has forgotten respect, that has forgotten the word thanks, and that has forgotten the word honor. And so I just want to encourage you to just stop and go, have you ever stopped to reflect? Take 30 minutes and just sit down and get out a journal and think of all the key people in your story that helped you at pivotal moments in your life become who you are today. There were intersections, there were crossroads where you made a pivotal decision, a good decision, and there was somebody there to influence you, to guide you. Maybe you were stuck and there was that person who lifted you out of a pit when everybody else passed you by. Who was that person? And then stop and ask yourself, what have I ever done to actually thank them? What have I ever done to actually just go, you know what? You made a difference in my life, and I just want to honor that and thank you for that and recognize that. It's a biblical principle, that of honor, of thanks, of showing respect. My parents, for me, are really at the top of the list. I have an incredible mom and dad who just have believed in me my whole life, and I went through a lot of difficult times in my junior high years, but they just kept believing in me, and they were there for me. And I remember when I got married, I wanted to honor and recognize my parents, and I made a plaque to recognize and thank them. And I just said, thank you. And I wrote an individual plaque for each one of them. And I just said, thank you for all the, the diapers you changed, the, track meets you came to. And I just had this massive list of all the little details that I remembered of things that they did for me. And I presented that to them. And you know what? It was a really powerful moment where, they cried and I cried and, we all cried. And there was just something healthy for me to honor them. And you know what? It did more for me maybe than it even did for them. And when you stop to honor people who have helped you, you're going to find God does something inside of your own soul and inside of your own heart when you do that. There was a man named Pat Casperry who, when I really gave my life to Christ at about 15, he just snagged me on a Friday night. Actually, it was on a church weekend, and I had only been coming to church for a few weeks. And he goes, "Eric, what are you doing Friday night?" And I go, "Nothing." He goes, "I'm picking you up." And so he came by my house and he picked me up because he was smart. He didn't give me a choice not to show up. He knew if he picked me up, I had to go. And Pat, he got saved in the Jesus movement of the early 70s. He was a hippie that never stopped being a hippie, but he was an all-out hippie for Jesus. And he goes, man, we're going to go out street witnessing. He didn't actually tell me that until we are actually in the car, I think. Otherwise, I would have said no. And so we go out street witnessing, and then he just got me hooked on evangelism. He taught me how to evangelize, and then he'd take me out to coffee after, and, hey, what'd you think, and what'd you learn, and what'd you say, and how'd you handle that when you asked you this question? And then he started, he'd take me to different conferences. We'd drive down from our town in Santa Rosa, California, down to San Francisco, and we go to an evangelism conference. And all these years that he just invested into me during my high school years, and he discipled me. He changed my life. And what we do now is, for the last 10 years at Element Church, we've actually financially supported him and his wife, Wendy. They're missionaries, and they've been missionaries now for over 25 years, I think coming on 35 years, to China, Thailand, and Burma. And they do phenomenal things in Asia. And they do like the legit Rambo missions type stuff, like where they're in the jungle, sleeping on dirt floors, eating things that doesn't have a name because it's so ugly you wouldn't name it, and they eat it. Like, they're doing the legit all-out mission stuff that most of us in America just could not do. But I'm very happy to send them a check and go, hey, love you, we believe in you. And over the last decade, we've been able to honor him and just serve them. And there's so many stories of how we've come through to support them and help them in crisis. And they're so grateful for what we're doing for them as a church. So all those giving to Kingdom Builders, just know you're making a difference. And you're going into places that you and I couldn't get into. And they're seeing so many people come to Christ. And they're seeing church pastors and leaders out in these jungles being discipled and equipped. And we're part of that. But really, a lot of that simply came back from me reflecting one day going, you know what? This man invested so much into me. I want to find a way to honor him and thank him. And then in a course of a dialogue, I discover what he's doing, and I go, we got to be a part. And so for 10 years now, we've been a part of blessing them, and in the process, they're still blessing us. My first pastor that I ever had, his name was Mike, Pastor Mike. And he was a bivocational pastor. He was an accountant. And he was pretty much everything you would think an accountant might be, not very like, woo, but just steady, plotter, detailed, sweet, kind, just a really, really good man. And he would take me out for breakfast before school, and he would teach me the Bible, and he was answering my questions. It was interesting. One of the things he said to me, he goes, statistically, Eric, you're probably not going to make it. Most people who get saved and get excited like you just fall off. And I don't know if that actually was a good thing, but for me, a high D personality, that was a challenge. I'm like, I'm going to prove you wrong, and I'm going to defy that statistic. So maybe I needed that. I don't know. Maybe that was enough to go, yeah, I'll prove you wrong, because that's kind of who I am. Anyway, so years later, he really made a difference inside of my life. And years later, I was in my hometown, and I was preaching at another church. Mike had resigned his church, and he had gone on and kind of just went back into a full-time career. And honestly, it might be easy for him to think, maybe I failed. Maybe I didn't really, do as much as I wanted to do. And the devil will just beat somebody up like that. But you know what? Maybe if all Mike ever did was pastor that church for me, I don't know, maybe it was worth it. By God's grace, I've helped influence 50,000 plus people to come to Christ. The things that Element Church are doing around the world today are influencing thousands and thousands of people. And you know what? If Mike did all that just for me, I'm good with it. And so I invited Mike. I was young. I was in my early 20s, and I was preaching there in my hometown. And I invited Mike to come and hear me speak. And I put him right on the front row, right next to my parents, because my parents actually happened to be there as well at that time. And I preached, and I took a moment, and I honored Mike in front of that entire church, and just took about 5 minutes talking about what he did in my life. And he was literally crying on the front row, tears coming down his face, because I just took a moment to honor him publicly for what he did inside of my life. And, there's just people who have helped you get where you are. And if you'll just stop, maybe it was a school teacher years ago. Maybe it was a coach. Maybe it was just a friend, who knows? But just stop and make a list. Who helped you get where you are? Who are those people that did something significant for you? And then ask this question: what have I ever really done to simply thank them, to honor them, and to just show them gratitude? Maybe it's a phone call. Maybe it's taking them out. Maybe it's just sending them a little something. I don't know. Let the Holy Spirit speak to you as to what will be meaningful to them, but it will be good for them, and you'll find it'll be really good for you. We're going to pick up with this story next week because there's so many great truths about leadership, about Christ, about being a Christ follower in this story that we see about Mephibosheth, and we'll see that next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.